I want to begin first by saying something that may seem obvious, right? Like it's something that you might be feeling, right? That a world without capitalism feels like an impossible task. I was born in the 1990s, and like everyone in my generation and maybe after, the capitalism I've always known is global capitalism that's always been in crisis. I've only seen wars, genocide, the financial crisis, the ecological destruction, and the pandemic. In such a world where capitalism is everywhere and in everything, how can we even begin to think about a new world? How can we have hope? The options before us feel limited. All choices seem that are presented to us are choices presented to us by the ruling class. A vote for any of them is still a vote for capitalism. A vote for any of them today is still a vote for genocide. So where is our choice? Where is our voice? And how do we, and without a voice, how can we win a world without capitalism? But it is also at this point of hopelessness that we reach into our past and we remember. And we remember what Ursula Le Guin said, and it's a quote that you might have seen on your social media because it comes up once in a while. The quote is, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. But so did the divine right of the kings. All human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." So when we remember every movement that achieved something, the Russian Revolution, the abolition of slavery, women's struggles, anti-colonial struggles, the gay rights movement, we see ourselves reflected in the pages of that history. Similar people, similar debates, similar fears, similar desires. It was people like us in the past, against all expectations, in the most impossible of times, who stood shoulder to shoulder and transformed the world. So we look, and we also look back to learn lessons. What did we do wrong? How do we make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes? So I want to begin by emphasizing the importance of memory in order for us to have hope, because I will come back to that at the very end, because I think it's an important question in terms of strategy. So what is the universities today? What is this post-secondary education? So I want to begin by talking about that. We have already discussed that there is a rising immigrant movement, anti-immigrant movement. There's also been that has sustained a focus on migrant students. We know of the racist hate that's online. We spoke about this racist graffiti in our cities, movements that are trying to give it an organized form that I'm not going to take the name of because I don't want to give them that pleasure. We see that Pierre Poilievre is very happy with it. We see Justin Trudeau and Mark Miller being pulled further and further to the right on the immigration question. And we see NDP is happy to be silent. But at the same time, we also see some incredible fight back. We see this, like the students in Brampton with the Naujawan Support Network, who have been camping for 1 month now, demanding dignity and fairness. We need the union movement and all communities to stand behind them and stand behind migrant students and workers as a whole and make sure there is a fair path to a dignified life. But I want to provide some perspective into what has happened here. What has led to this situation? Because knowing that is crucial to know how we can fight back. And the answer lies in the market economics of the post-secondary education system in Canada, which I think Michelle in the first session mentioned as the underbelly of the post-education sector, which we need to address. We need to address it head on. The story, we can begin telling the story in 1998, where at which point the government funding accounted for roughly 84% of an average university budget. But in the 2000s, that figure dropped to just over 50%. And today morning, Avi said right now it's 30%. So what happened in the 90s? Mike Harris and Brian Mulroney happened in the 90s. There is a chart, and I don't know if I can pull this up, that shows, I'll show this to the people on Zoom, but also show people after, which is kind of the rate of reduction of provincial grants in the 90s against the tuition increase paid by domestic students in the same period. It's precise. The exact amount, almost to the penny, the exact amount of funding that was reduced was the funding that was charged. It's an attack on public education that happened. It was public education was attacked, it was hollowed out, and the cost of education was offloaded onto the students and their families themselves. This is not something that Mike Harris introduced. This is also the story from 1990 to 95 under Bob Rae. Because this story happened as a result of the recession that happened, of course, in the early 90s, which was driven by Brian Mulroney's austerity. Brian Mulroney, along with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, were the holy trinity of neoliberal austerity. And this is sort of like the root. So it sort of begins with a crisis. So at the turn of the millennium, the government funding was slashed and the universities were now made to rely on increasing domestic tuition fees, but also turning to private donations from wealthy individuals and corporations to fund their operations. This, in effect, made the post-secondary education extremely expensive for working people and families. This is also how the system made domestic students dependent on debt. But since working Canadians are also voters and at least have some political voice, if formally in Canada, the extent to which the tuition fees was increased had to be limited. So universities began to be more and more dependent on private donors and corporations. And then capitalism fell apart in 2008. From the financial crisis hits Canada, and suddenly the private donors and corporations were not so magnanimous anymore. So what do the universities now do to fund their operations? They realize that, okay, the provincial tuition fees freeze does not apply to migrant students, and suddenly internationalization became a buzzword in post-secondary education. All the universities and colleges began to draft up strategic plans to recruit more migrant students. From 2013 to 2023, the number of migrant students in Canada increased by 200%. And these students were charged twice, thrice, and sometimes 5 times the tuition fee as our domestic colleagues. In 2018, the tuition fees and rental expenses that migrant students paid into the Canadian economy made up for $21.6 billion of the GDP. In 2022, that number was $31 billion. Just to put this into perspective, this is more than the income that Canada makes from export of auto parts, lumber, and aircraft. And this is the money that kept the many Canadian post-secondary institutions from going bankrupt. And most of the students also come from countries that were colonized by the British and French empires. So what has happened here must also be seen as a neo-colonial transfer of wealth from colonies back into the empire. Let's sit with that for a moment. And when we think, Avi said this morning about that money is now being used to fund a genocide. And so in addition to this being an education issue, this is also a labor issue. Over the last few years, with the rise in cost of living in Canada, migrant students have been forced into working all the dangerous and minimum wage jobs. We know that the Canadian food economy is built on temporary migrant labor. From the farm workers to many of the transport workers, to the fast food retail workers, to the gig economy delivery workers. We saw during the pandemic shutdown how the entire system was dependent to a great extent on migrant labor, temporary, precarious, racialized migrant labor. So this is not just about the post-secondary education. This is also about racism in the labor market. Here I want to read a small passage from a federal government document. So this is in 2019, where the federal government released a report called Building on Success, International Education Strategy 2019 to 2024. Passage says, due in part to the aging of Canada's population, immigration is required for workforce growth. International students make excellent candidates for permanent residency. They are relatively young, proficient in at least one official language, have Canadian educational qualifications, and can help the country's current and pending labor market needs. Now, I want to indicate something very evil here. This is how the federal government from the beginning has dangled this idea of permanent residency as a carrot, only to use migrant students to save the post-secondary education system that was going bankrupt, and only to exploit their labor and continuing to exploit their labor, And now Mark Miller and Justin Trudeau say that permanent residency was never a promise. Having worked so hard in this country, having saved its post-secondary education system from going bankrupt, having kept the economy afloat during the pandemic, the students must all go back now just so you can try to win another term in the office. This is where, to quote Greta Thunberg, we ask, how dare you? And we ask the NDP, how dare you be silent? And this is why the slogan that the students at the Naujawan Support Network has raised is so powerful. Good enough to work, good enough to stay.
Mm-hmm.
The reason they all give, all the sort of like ruling powers give, is that there is stress on the housing market. But today, international students make up around 2% of the population in Canada. Are we saying that a population of 2%, most of whom live in shared single room, they are the cost of housing crisis and the cost of living crisis in Canada? This country is surely greater than that. Of course, blaming the students mean that Trudeau and Poilievre can save their friends in the real estate, their developer friends, their corporate landlord friends, who would much rather leave an apartment empty than reduce the rent. Thousands and thousands of condos right now are sitting empty in Toronto, and the landlords are saying they are having difficulty finding tenants. And they blame the students. So this is the story of the crisis of the university system, but also a broader crisis. How Brian Mulroney pushed an entire country's education system into a long-term crisis. The same union-busting neoliberal politician who sent the military to the siege of Kanesatake that you might know as the Oka crisis, it is the same Mulroney that Pierre Poilievre has called our greatest statesman ever. I'm saying this, emphasizing to indicate how our struggles were interlinked then and our struggles are interlinked today. This is capitalism. It is a system that is inherently prone to crisis, and when it faces crisis, it has to try and push it into the future or find some way to put a band-aid. And the band-aid was migrant student exploitation, but the crisis always returns. And it returned today. The Liberal government slashed migrant student study permit, and the universities are slipping once more into a deep budget crisis. Within 1 week of federal government announcing their recruitment freeze, Queen's University decided that they can no longer fund master's research, even for domestic students. This affects all of us. We should know that this crisis is an artificial scarcity. They have millions of dollars invested in the genocide of Palestinians, but no means to run a university. They can invent new and redundant positions in the upper administration, paying them $200,000 a year, but they cannot give a master's student a funding to do their research. Surely a better world is possible. So I hope I was able to show how all of this is connected to the history of capitalism in Canada, how the failures of the capitalist system from the recession in the 90s to the financial crisis in 2008 lead us to where we are today. So the question of strategy is a question of politics, of how we are all interconnected in the struggle against this settler colonial capitalist system. Ultimately, it's simple. The crucial weakness of the capitalist system is that it depends on us much more than we depend on it. Just this fact gives us inherently more power than the biggest weapon of the ruling class. It is a system of artificial scarcity and natural abundance. And to imagine a world without capitalism is to imagine a world in which we use our power to establish direct control over the natural abundance so that we can eliminate that artificial scarcity. This is the wisdom behind the dish with one spoon wampum bill covenant, the treaty behind Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee on whose territory we are currently speaking, to make sure that everyone has enough, that nobody is hungry, that nobody is exploiting the resources, and there's always enough for future generations. This is also the meaning of that beautiful sentence in the manifesto, Communist Manifesto, from each according to ability and to each according to need. How do we get there? So first, it starts with participating in the struggle, whatever that may look like for us right now. We cannot just be on the outside. Only being in the struggle can help us clarify our own ideas, and help us clarify the ideas of others. In our tradition, we don't consider Marxism to be a permanent dogma. Socialist ideas can and must evolve with the concrete reality of the times that we live in. So we must be active in the struggle around us. Secondly, once we are in the struggle, we must always bring more people in. It's always broadening our movement, understanding we have shared desires, which might not always be self-evident. And when movements broaden, magic happens. We already saw just a couple of months ago how students in Bangladesh started a movement against the dictatorial Sheikh Hasina regime. There are such important lessons to learn. It started as a student movement against a quota system in the government jobs. But the state decided to respond to the peaceful student movement by using the full force of state repression, by unleashing the police and military upon the students, killing hundreds. But the state repression led only to the movement broadening, where workers, unions, peoples from all walks of life joined together, and the issue no longer became about quota, but all the interconnected issues of capitalism were laid bare. Inflation, corruption, poverty, unemployment, everything. And finally, they launched a total non-cooperation movement. And people familiar with the sort of South Asian anti-colonial history might know this total non-cooperation is basically a general strike mixed with some kind of civil disobedience. And they stopped paying taxes, utility bills. Nobody went to work. Government and private institutions were shut down. This strangulated the government of all the revenue, and no amount of state repression could save Sheikh Hasina anymore. She had to take the helicopter, fly out of the country, putting an end to the dictatorial regime. This is the kind of magic that becomes possible when workers and students come together in a shared struggle. But the question always remains, what next? And this has been the question every time. The question in Egypt, the question in Sudan, the question in Sri Lanka, the question in Bangladesh. And I think this does bring me back to my conclusion, which is the question which we started with about the importance of memory and hope. Mariam Kaba said, hope is a discipline. It is not something we just get. It is something that we have to practice through our actions every day. And for that, we have to learn from the struggles of our past. In our tradition, we believe that the Revolutionary Party is the memory of the working class. The ruling class has a long memory, the same way they have generational wealth. They have the institutions like judiciary, they have parliament, the university, and so on. But as the working class, we don't have a natural history of our long struggle. We have to learn and remember. We have to piece things together by talking to our elders, to our co-workers, searching on the internet, and so on. So this is where a revolutionary party is the organized memory of the working class. It brings together our lessons from the movements that we are part of today and were part of in the past, and build upon those lessons. It is what connects us to the shared past, helping us clarify our ideas, ultimately informing how we build a movement today. So ultimately, the question of strategy for me is to be organized. And with that, I will end. And if you agree with these ideas, I invite maybe in the International Socialists at your organization. Thank you.
Right. Start? Oh,
Yep.
Sorry. My name is Rich Whyman, for those that maybe missed the introduction. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the state of the class struggle, because I think a lot of the topics we've hit on today are depressing, so to say. The rise of the right, the genocide, the ongoing genocide, and our government's complicity in it in Palestine. Very bleak sort of discussions, I think, for people to have. And I think if we look at the last 4 years coming out of COVID, the bright light happening right now has been the remarkable return of the strike, not just in Canada, but around the world right now. In the United States, I think all kinds of ports are being shut down by the ILA, or American Comrades can correct me or not. The ILA was an old sort of mob, very right-wing union. If you ever watch On the Waterfront, it's about them. Not necessarily the bastion of progression, but big strikes going on there. And then, of course, here in Canada, some quite massive strikes. You wouldn't necessarily know it from reading the news. Occasionally, the mainstream media has to acknowledge this sort of phenomenon that's been going on. But I think it's worth for us in this room to look at that phenomenon, to discuss it a little bit, talk about what does it mean for the ongoing struggles, not just around workers at the workplace, but all the other struggles that are going on, because they are connected when we step back and take a look at it. So after being forced to work throughout COVID, bosses and managers, anybody who had a job on the shop floor or various places, you knew the joyful experiment of you having to get on the subway and go to work every day, and the warehouses, particularly in the sort of outer layers of Toronto, Brampton, and Vaughan, and places like that. Hundreds of thousands of people going to work every day on crowded and breaking down subway systems, transit workers having to go to work. Yet for some reason, every supervisor seemed to be able to go home. Managers seemed to be able to work from home. They made sure that they were protected and safe during the pandemic. But somehow people who made mattresses were told that they were an essential ingredient in the society, and therefore they had to go to work. That, people stacking, phone covers at, in a warehouse, that they were essential. They had to go to work. Of course, nurses, hospital staff told they were essential, but yet their managers were allowed to stay at home. All of this sort of going on throughout COVID, breeding, at the time, people, I think, felt very proud that they were the COVID heroes. They were on the front lines doing all this. But, as time goes on, people get sick, people don't feel well, coworkers pass away. All of a sudden that, yay, I'm on the front lines turns into, where on earth is my fucking boss? At home, and a chalet, wherever they may be, having a grand old time, making sure that they and their family are safe. Well, your family is put at risk because you have to go and pay a landlord who is ripping you off on a daily basis. So we have the backdrop of that. And then coming out of COVID, we have people watching the exponential growth of the top 1%'s wealth, of the pandemic profiteers, of people who made billions and billions of dollars. Well, people sacrificed their lives to be at work in hospitals and other places and had their wages frozen by governments at the same time. So we see this sort of, two things coming together to create an anger. And then we had the explosion of inflation coming out of this, creating an incredibly combustible situation. So we went from an extremely low point of people fighting back at the beginning of COVID. And partly this is because in class struggle, like in all things in society, I think, when things are new, people kind of rally around them. Leon Trotsky, I cannot remember what book it is. He may be talking about the Balkans War, which is a giant tome, and I haven't cracked it in a while. Talks about how when a war starts, and like when a world war starts, it builds this national unity that workers somehow go against their own interests. And it's almost because it's something new and big and shakes up the daily doldrums. The beginning of COVID was a bit like that, I think, for a lot of things. There was a lull, the we're all in it together sort of BS really stuck to people, I think. But as it went on, and as we came out of COVID, that fell down. That very notion that we're all in it together crumbled when your boss wasn't at work. It crumbled again when your landlord was able to jack your rent. And it crumbled again when you were told your wages wouldn't go up to match the inflation that was happening. So we've seen a response to that. Whether it's conscious or not, it was a response. And there's a lot of pundits and academics and people that are trying to explain this stuff away. I just think it's remarkable when I look at the numbers. Since 2022, 1.4 million workers in Canada have gone on strike. That's an incredible number. Okay? And an overwhelming number of those workers, I can't think of a strike that has been defeated. People might not have won everything they wanted, but I cannot think, going through, talking to people I know, looking at them, I can't think of a single one where employers' concessions actually made it through to the, to the vote. Almost every one of these is victories. Quite often, these strikes occurred because a bargaining team came back and said, hey, folks, this is the best contract we've ever negotiated in like 25 years. And workers would still say, nah, not good enough. We need more. And we're able to actually push and go on the offensive. I just want to break down the numbers that represents just a little bit so people can get a sense, because I think it's hard. Because picket lines, there's no generalization of this, which I'll touch on in a little bit. So you can get kind of lost and not seeing it. But that means that there were 1,100 strikes in that time period I'm talking about. 158 strikes in 2021. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that means 3 groups of workers each week in 2021 decided they'd had enough with what their employer was putting on the table and decided to stand up and challenge the whole market edifice we're raised with. I don't think people can appreciate that, whether people do it consciously or not. When you go on strike, you're actually challenging the whole capitalist nature that somehow your employer gets to rip you off every day at work by extracting surplus from you. And you're challenging their God-given right under the capitalist sort of notion of democracy to do that. You're challenging them on it to say, no, I get to actually determine. It's kind of shitty in a weird way because it's not quite revolutionary overthrow capitalism, but I will play a role in negotiating my own exploitation. It will not be a one-sided relationship. And I think that that's incredibly important. So 158 strikes in 2021, 152 in 2022. Are you ready for what happened last year? 730 strikes, just as inflation hit its peak. A massive number of strikes. So far to date this year, 71, but that only goes up to the beginning of June. So it doesn't include the WestJet strike, doesn't include the rail strike, doesn't include a whole bunch of other things. Still 2.5 strikes per week, groups of workers walking out. And some of these aren't just strikes, they've been big moments that have punctured the popular sort of outlook on things. If you think about this, the building trade strike in 2022, first time carpenters, I think, in Toronto, the GTA area, have been on strike in almost 100, insane long time. But I think it was about 40,000 different building trades workers went out on strike in that period. Massive strike, opened up the floodgates, I think, for actually more people to start to demand more. The school board in the fall of 2022, wildcat, well, not a wildcat, but an illegal work stoppage. While I don't believe the strike itself fully won, it did beat back Doug Ford's anti-trade union legislation and electrified pretty much everybody in the labor movement. PSAC in the spring of 2023, massive strike, rebuilding that workplace. Ports in Vancouver, most recently the rail strike, short-lived. Thank you, Justin Trudeau, for your scabby back to work legislation. The WestJet, the heroic small group of 700 people at WestJet, the mechanics there, who challenged Justin Trudeau and I think punctured. I think they were the ones that, they might not know it themselves, that punctured the dirty deal between Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau. I think that that was the thing that sank that deal more than anything else. Those 700 workers from a tiny little union with very few resources, they decided to read the federal labor code a very particular way, which said you do not have the democratic right to take my strike away. This is a democratic right in this country. You don't have to take it away. And the courts backed off, actually, in that phase. So when we talk about, oh, the courts are neutral in the term, there's no neutrals in class struggle. The courts are with the employers. AMFA called the bluff. They won that strike, and watched the employers' demand change overnight from basically 2, 2, and 2, and not much change in working conditions, to like 10. Like they just skyrocketed, not quite to what they're, similar people in similar workplaces do in the United States, but they jumped up several years of going backwards and made massive gains through that. That's opened up other things. And I don't believe that this level of struggle is letting up. Montreal Ports, who, if you remember at the beginning, in the middle of COVID, also went out on strike, and there Trudeau broke that strike as well in favor of the bosses. They're going back out on a 3-day sort of rotating strike to force a contract. Grain workers at the ports of Vancouver out on strike right now. We have Cup W moving into a strike position soon. College faculty. There are big strikes coming down that we have to pay attention to, because this is where workers actually get a sense of their own power. Okay? Because they're asserting themselves against their employer, against everything you've been taught in life about this fair, democratic, BS little world we live in. They're actually challenging all of that. And that's why these things are important. So the anger is clear at the situation workers found themselves in: skyrocketing costs, corporate profits, labor shortages, and workers, for a long time, if you think about that, just coming out of COVID, there was all the ballyhoo about labor shortages. Well, the ruling class was trying to use that to say, oh, we're in a crisis. Working people said, oh, so you actually need me now more than I need you, because I can just go down the road again. And that has a tremendous confidence builder. It's why you look in the history of like sort of world wars, when there's a draft, there also tends to be a massive strike wave that comes towards the end of the war, because those who are still at work recognize that, unfortunately, due to imperialist barbarism, there's a shortage of work, and that actually builds up people's confidence. And if you think about it, massive reason for everybody to be fighting. Rents in Ontario, the past 10 years, have gone up. This is on average. This is not just the specific locations. 54.5%. And when people say, oh, bring back rent control, 5 of those years were when there was rent control still in. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the laws we have. Landlords and corporations will still try to find ways to jack up the rent. People with mortgages last year saw their mortgage rates go up 25.4%, a massive hike. Food up last year by 10%, and that they discount tons of items when they do this, by the way. When you read the government Stats Canada and they do the consumer price index, they yank almost everything that's important to us. So they say, oh, mortgages are too volatile. We won't count those. Rent is too volatile. We won't count those. Luxury yachts haven't gone up. We'll put those in the pile here, right? So then they come down with this inflationary number that every working person knows is not good, right? We know that sure, inflation went up 8%. You know, a loaf of bread went up 100%, right? Get a bundle of bananas is like 3 times as much as it used to be. So we know what those costs are. We know what the fuel costs are. If you have to drive for a living because the TTC's been destroyed by successive years of underfunding, you know what the pumps were killing you. If you live in rural areas and you have to fuel your house, how much those costs were. So everybody felt that. And if you add to all of that the backdrop of 40 years of wage and income stagnation, 40, okay? The vast majority of my life on this planet has been one where household income has not gone up at all. Actually, it has. I lied. It has gone up $400. So in 2022 dollar figures, the average household income in 40 years has only gone up $400. Just think about that. And what does that 40 years coincide with? Because we've talked a lot about this. The beginnings of the fight around, boycott and divestment. Think about when those fights started. Talking about the crisis of universities and that 40 years, the advent of the real hard push of neoliberalism, right? Of the ruling class saying this post-war pact, whatever you want to call it, is over. There's no more of this. If you work hard and you do your bit, you're going to have like a place to live. You can get a week's vacation and you can afford to carry on. Now we're done with that. We need to find new sources of profit. So we are going to rip apart everything. We can't do it all at once. Because the funny thing for the ruling classes, there's another class that often sort of hangs around and stands in their way, and that's the working class. And working class people were on the defensive, looked to their leaderships in the NDP, and other places, trade union leadership, didn't quite get the lead, but there were big fights. If anybody wants to talk about the general strikes against Harris, it isn't as if these changes happened easily. There were big fights for that. So this is where the state of class struggle is. I think there's a lot of anger, and we've talked about where that anger goes. But we know that picket lines can change people's consciousness. It forces workers who may not know each other that well to actually stand together. So people may have racist words, but then you watch their deeds of standing side by side, helping the immigrant worker beside them pay their rent. Anybody that's been out on picket lines has seen these moments, right? I think even like the picket line that Carolyn was referring to in Ingersoll, huge community support for that. Barbecues, all these sorts of things, just genuine sort of solidarity going on like that. So here's the other side. Faced with this rising push, and wages actually over the past couple of years haven't caught up with inflation, but that huge dip, that push has actually begun to push back. Now, the ruling class, of course, is not particularly happy with this. They don't like the idea that they don't get to control all the profits in the world and that workers are pushing back to try to gain some of their own, right? And standing up. And they also know, not just on the dollars and cents figure, but the notion of collective action to challenge capitalism at the point of production in a workplace is an extremely dangerous idea if you make your living out of exploiting people at the point of production in the workplace. So the idea that people will organize themselves to fight back is extremely dangerous. It's not just the wage demands that bother the ruling class. It's this notion that that becomes contagious inside the working class. Hey, those guys at WestJet, they did it. What did the pilots at Air Canada do? They shot down the first contract and said, we're striking whether the government gives us permission to or not. The Teamsters, for the first time I can recall since they took over the rail unions, actually hounded the Liberals. Normally, Liberals order them back to work. Teamster leadership is, oh, geez, oh, well, what can we do? It's all right, we'll see you later. Geez, our strike fund just grew. I don't know why. So usually that's the case. This time they hounded the Minister of Labor. They hounded Trudeau. I hadn't seen it. It was fantastic. And I'll make a note. If more trade union leaders did that, the hold of Convoy and fuck Trudeau would have a lot less strength against So, oh my goodness, 5 minutes. Okay, so a couple quick things. It's not all rosy. It's nice and sunny days for the moment. And it's actually, I would say, the sun is beginning to set if you look sort of ahead on where things are. The joy is class struggle often lags well behind where, the bean counters in the federal government put stats, right? So inflation's coming down. That's creating problems at bargaining tables now because people have pent up wage demands. And every employer that for the past 30 years, outside the past 2, said you have to keep your wage demands in line with inflation. And then when inflation was at 8%, they said, no, we don't mean that. Are now back at the bargaining table saying, wait, no, remember when we said you had to keep everything in line with inflation? Now that it's down to 3%, we think that's good enough, right? So there's a fight there because there's still a bitterness and an anger. If you signed a contract in 2021 or 2022 before the big inflationary hits, you're still in this mix where your rent is skyrocket, all this, and you've been looking at 3s or 2s, or in some cases 1.75 wage increases, not enough. So they're seeing this and they know that. So what is the ruling class done? The first step they did to combat that confidence that was coming out, they drove up interest rates. Okay, you've probably seen what is his name? I always forget his name. Is it Mark Carney or is he the old one? It's I can't remember the name of the new guy that's ruining all our lives. But anyway, with Trudeau, and Trudeau will always say, "Oh, we don't control the Bank of Canada." The Canadian government sends all the signals to the Bank of Canada what to do. Okay, so they sent the signal: drive up interest rates as our way to contain inflation. Well, most people said, "Oh, good, you're doing something to contain inflation." Finally, the trick there is, what does driving up inflation rates mean? It means you pay more for your mortgage. It means you pay more for the loans you have on your credit card. It means everything goes up because most working class people carry 130 to 140% of their annual income in debt. So it now means all your debt servicing goes through the roof. So all those wage gains you just made are now being given thanks to the Bank of Canada. Who's getting this money? Yeah, the 1% is going right back to the banks. That was Justin Trudeau's wonderful trick. So drive up inflation rates to bring down inflation, but also to put an extra tax on working class people so they're not as confident to strike. Losing a week's pay now becomes a much bigger thing to gamble. All of those sorts of things. Two, they made a concerted effort to end what they called the myth of the labor shortage. What was their method? Was to trick international students into the idea that they would be able to have a job here, open the floodgates, which we have to be clear, we are not opposed to this. We are for open borders. We are for free migration of capital, free migration of humans should be our position, right? You want to move billions around like that, then human beings should be able to move around like that. So it isn't about anything to do with that. But their strategy was to create this crisis, to try to drive up unemployment. This is what our government was doing, attempting to drive up unemployment to depress wages. They know that once we go back to saying, Christ, I really need my boss, we stop having that confidence to challenge as much as what was going on. And the second thing is a massive drive on productivity. You cannot open the business press today without hearing the squeals of these greedy little pigs screaming that the problem in Canada, the reason wages are stagnant, are not because of Galen Weston's massive profits. They're actually because Canadian workers aren't productive enough. Okay? Now, productive enough means you don't work hard enough for less money. Okay, that's what their thing is. You can't, I'm serious. Like every day they look how Canada's middle class got shafted. You read this, oh, that's good. The Globe and Mail, oh my goodness, they're actually, no, it's because of low productivity in Canada, because there's too many burdens to investment and, you know, smart little, Bay Street people for creating, what are those hubs called? Whatever they are, where, you know, they get venture capitalism and stuff. Too much red tape. We need to free it up so that they can do all this stuff to drive productivity. Anyway, this is what they're driving on, and it's going to create problems for us down the road. And that's part of our job, is to foresee where these things are so we can begin to make arguments. We started, like this time last year, making the argument that the next drive by the ruling class is going to be a racist scapegoating of immigrants. And sure enough, like I hate to be right. God, I wish we were wrong all the time on these things, but that's exactly what they're doing. The Canadian ruling class used immigrant workers, particularly students, people on temporary foreign worker permits, to fill positions that they could not fill, okay, during COVID, offering them the promise that they would have a pathway to quote unquote citizenship in this horrible little country, but it's better than a lot of places where, in terms of standard of living. And they've ripped that out now that there's a racist backlash. So Trudeau's trying to have a double here, right? Brought people in to try to crack the militancy inside the working class. And now he's trying to don't look over here at all our problems. Don't look at the 40 billion we just gave, Volkswagen, General Motors, all these huge multinational companies. Don't look at that as the problem. Look over here at this person working at the Tim Hortons, or as a security guard, or whatever. You know what I mean? Don't look over here at the 25 billion we just gave to oil and gas billionaires. Look at this. Don't look over here at the $110 billion we gave to employers during COVID, which equals $5,300 for every single worker in Canada. Don't look at that as being the problem. Because if you want to talk about the problem of productivity, what did the goddamn bosses do with that money? Did they invest it in production? Did they invest it in anything to create jobs? No. They pocketed it and paid out all their CEOs and shareholders bonuses. Bell, GM, every major company that got huge sums. The Bell one was astounding because it was like a dollar for dollar figure. Hey, we got, $800 million from the federal government. Guess what our shareholders just got? $800 million. So this is the situation we're in, where you can see these things trying to undermine this stuff. Fortunately, like I said, there are some big strikes coming down that can move that ship. But there's the ideological question that I think is so important on the question of productivity, because unfortunately, with all of this going on, and I've probably got 2 minutes, you would think that there would be huge excitement at the OFL leadership, at the CLC leadership, inside all the national union offices in Canada. Oh my God, the workers are fighting. We've just spent the past 15 years bemoaning how the workers don't care, our members won't fight, blah, 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 blah. That was our excuse. Now they're fighting. What is the answer? To do anything but talk about strikes. If you look at it, they won't. No attempt to knit together any single strike that has happened. And this isn't just the labor centrals, it's the labor leaderships of the unions themselves that are on strike. 1,000 meat processing workers in Guelph, low-paid meat processors, responsible for most of the meat production in Southern Ontario. Anybody know they were on strike?
No.
No, they gummed up the whole food chain in Ontario, right? If you think about that, when the rail workers went on strike, where was the call to shut the country down in solidarity with them? If you think about the lead that could have been given time and time and time again, how that would reverse the pull, the allure of that scumbag Paul Revere and his posing as a worker. The man has never had a callus in his fucking life, okay? He's never done a day's work, ever. Challenge his supporters. What job has he ever had? He's a career politician, okay? He's like the Trump. We're going to drain the swamp. You are the fucking swamp, Pierre Paul there, okay? So we have to be firm on that stuff. But that pull and that allure wouldn't exist if people felt there was a viable alternative that was going to stand up and fight for them, and fight against the employers and against the rich and against the 1%. Instead, what we've seen is our leaders constantly crave to run to that center, to crave stability in a world where working class people feel no stability anymore. So the only option we have is to put pressure on the trade union leaders to stand up, and start to move, and not with just nice speeches, but on the shop floor. Where are going to be the solidarity strikes? What are we going to do when Cup W goes out? Are we going to call for a shutdown of all logistics in solidarity? Are we going to call for a shutdown of the ports when the Montreal port workers go? Are we going to do those calls for solidarity? Because I bet you dollars to donuts on the shop floor in thousands of those workplaces, workers would agree. They'd be like, yeah, do you think we can get a head out of this? Yes, we can. Let's go. But the leadership doesn't want to do it because they're terrified of that instability. They love the normal labor relations, okay? I don't know why I do bargaining sometimes. And fucking hate it. It's so dry. Like, come on, let's put some life into this and strike. So you would think that, that this would be there, but it's not. And I would say the reason it's not there is because the political strategy of the trade union leadership is not to foment struggle, but to contain struggle. I got like 2 minutes left, I know. And I won't wrap up. But the strategy is to rely on the NDP. Okay, and let's just be clear about what that means. Okay, and the NDP, for all its faults, I would argue is still, there's some connective tissue left between the working class movement and that as a political party, and still some interplay. But if you live in Manitoba right now, you just got and you're a public sector worker, you just got a worse contract than public sector workers in Ontario. So you tell me what the material reality of that government is going to mean in 4 years when the right wing starts to woo those working people towards them. You can see what this is, right? So the political strategy of the NDP is to win seats, not to make power for workers, to perhaps maybe make some incremental reform. Well, what I'm talking about is trying to find a way to build an organization that knits together as many militants as we can. You got to tell me to shut up soon because I'm going to go for it.
5 seconds.
To knit together militants in different struggles to try to generalize this. To try to generalize that in a world of the horrors of racism and genocide in Palestine, there's still a glimmer of hope inside the working class. And that we can win those working class people in struggle to a broader set of politics that says when we're united, okay, when we're united in standing up for trans rights, when we're united defending women's right to choose, when we're standing up and defending the right to strike, we're fighting for democracy and we're fighting for workers' freedom here. Okay, I love using the word freedom now because it's just got such a great meaning to some people, that we can do that. But you have to have an organization. We have to have a network that does that. Anyway, I'll shut up there. So please, if you're not in the International Socialist, think about joining. Come out to more meetings. go out to picket lines with leaflets, talk to people about how we desperately need to build an alternative to what's on the table here. Because there's a moment there where workers are fighting and we desperately need to find some way to take advantage of it. Sorry, people.